And we can now proceed to our next and the last speaker, Radu Leca, who's the organizer, or co-organizer actually, organizer of this conference. Radu Leca is a scholar of Japanese culture, working on many topics like early modern mapmaking, pertaining to the geography of Japan, and also on early printing culture in Japan. And for today, Radu is going to give us some information about exoticism of paradise birds in early modern Japan. Radu,
yes,
the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? So I'm just going to make sure that I'm sharing the right screen. Okay, I think that's it. So we've heard a lot about different ideas of birdness. I think my paper is also deals with how to classify birds and how to deal with degrees of reality and myth. But this also refers to how we define, how to get away from our modern biological understanding of birds, kind of put ourselves in the minds of, in this case, of early modern Japan. So this is my attempt to kind of unpack what a paradise bird would mean to someone early modern Japan. Now, just to point out two things before starting, there is a well-researched history of paradise birds in Europe, right? So we have this whole history of these skins, these bird skins that reach Europe and they're thought to be without legs, right? And that's why we have this legend of the fact that the birds do not rest at all; they're always flying. So they get this name of paradise birds, which is now the official scientific name. But their history in early modern Japan is comparatively unresearched. And again, it's I stress this again, what we now understand by the family of paradise birds, there are 32 subspecies of paradise bird, that only partially overlaps with the paradise bird as early modern Japanese understood. So just to make this kind of difference clear, because it's easy to confuse. So a few things about early modern Japan, right? It's been mentioned. I just want to stress that this was a sort of federal polity, right? So we have these semi-autonomous Han, called them domains. So Edo is the administrative capital, but we have a degree of independence of each of these domains, right? And I'm mentioning this because it's relevant to the transmission of goods and of let's say, birds, but also of knowledge. So you will have kind of regional centers where knowledge can develop differently than, say, in Edo or in Nagasaki. And the center shifts gradually. So initially, 17th century, we have Kyoto as the cultural capital, and then kind of shifts to Edo. Right? So there's it's a long period. Things shift. So I will point out one of the shifts throughout. And also, there's a lot of focus on the trade in Nagasaki. And we must keep in mind that there were 3 other locations. There was the northern trade route in Ezo and through China. The Chinese artifacts entered through there. There was Tsushima, which is trade directly with Chosen, Korea, and then there was the Ryukyu Kingdom. But most of the sources I talk about, they talk about the Nagasaki as a trade, as a kind of gate for these birds to enter. But I think there's still room to do research on the other trade routes. So I'm also showing you, right? I'm showing you this early modern map, which also privileges routes, right? So the roads that crisscross the territory, and they kind of unite. It's a sort of circulatory system. It's a bit like a body has its arteries and blood vessels. And you can see here one of the main routes, and most important, is the Tokaido Road, which linked Kyoto with Edo here. And some of these maps have been described in these terms, as in the oldest maps have Kyoto at the center, and all roads lead to Kyoto, just as the all blood vessels lead to the heart in an organism, right? So I want to take that metaphor a bit further, and my father is a radiologist, so he uses MRI, and he often talks about contact agents, and so these are liquids, chemical markers that are inserted into the body to make it easier to visualize the internal organs. So they render certain areas more opaque, right? So you're able to see the borders between organs. Or in this case, they are used to visualize really capillaries and blood vessels. So to me, I'm starting to look at these paradise birds I will talk about as contact agents, and so they are foreign objects that enter this early modern Japanese cultural system, and they sort of travel along different routes, right? They sort of reveal the circulation, the different trajectories that an object can have. And by object, I don't mean just the physical object, but the understanding of it. So kind of the cultural package it comes with. Right? So these are not just physical objects, but they also carry stories with them and symbols, right? Associations. So I want to develop that concept. Maybe you can also, if you have any ideas, please share them. Yeah. Contrast agents. So I think we also yesterday we heard mentions of mythical birds in Buddhism, right? So we have this mythical background for paradisiacal birds, right? So there are many contexts in which birds are mentioned in ideal spaces related to religion, and one of them is Buddhism. And here, for example, you can recognize a kalavinka, right? A half woman, half bird, dweller of paradise, right? Sometimes they sing, right? They're famous for their voice. But the context here is not Buddhist, right? So in the case of Japan, we also have these mythical Taoist islands. This is Mount Penglai, or Mount Hora in Japanese. This is supposed to be out beyond the sea in the east of the continent, and only Taoist enlightened beings can reach there. Right? The Yang Gui Fei reaches there. So it's the stuff of Chinese legends. It reaches Japan, and there is a specific text that kind of gathers legends about this place, and it's 16th century text, but in the 17th century it starts to be illustrated. Now I put here a much earlier source from a kind of famous text, a novel, an aristocratic novel, where images of this place, Mount Penglai, are given as an example of Chinese-style paintings. And the point here is that this is a kind of fantastic land that you can really show in any way you want, and you can impress by showing it because people haven't seen it. And while it's difficult to paint chickens or dogs in an impressive way. Right? So here it's used as a symbol of Chinese-style painting and as something not fully known. But by the time you would get to the 17th century, we have these very specific elements that are associated with, and these are mostly borrowed from Buddhist paradise imagery. But one of these, right, and this particular illustration, and this I studied for my undergraduate thesis, so I looked through all illustrations of this text, different versions. Only in this one, we get these extra birds, right? So why are these here? They're not described in text, kind of an addition of the illustrator. One of them has this long tail. Let me move things around. You can see it's long tail there. Right? And again, I'm not positive if we're talking about a specific, which paradise bird we're talking about, but we have a long-tailed, no-leg bird that is associated with the paradisiacal space. And this is, in the next example, will be the same, is example of what we consider traditional imagery, but we have this influx of something extra, right? And I think we can at least hint at a connection to trade, right? Increase in trade in the 17th century that brings in new types of objects, right? Of birds in this case. And we have records, right? I will mention it. I'll mention it later. Well, records of the Dutch bringing in specimens. So they are skins. They're not live birds. And so we have a few mentioned in the 17th century. Then later 18th is later on. Only much later they start to bring in live birds. So for this, the moment we're just talking about these kind of preserved skins, and this is actually from the former shogunal collection. It's now the Tokugawa Art Museum. It's preserved as such, without legs. From the same period, this is a different kind of image. It's an elite object, and all this gold leaf. It shows a picnic scene, right? So these are cherry blossoms. So you put up a sort of screen to have semi-privacy. Textiles, different textiles, also showing off the different textiles you have. But one of them shows these long-tailed birds, and again, these are, there are a few Chinese style. There are some lions, Chinese lions here. There's the Paulownia leaf, right? This might be related to the imperial family. But we have these kind of expensive import textiles, while at the same time, and this kind of contradicts a bit this idea of traditional domestic imagery versus Chinese imagery. This kind of display kind of blends imported imagery and this poetic idea of cherry blossoms, this composing poems under the cherry blossom, but with Chinese brocades. So in this context, we have these birds, and just to understand them, right? So they are, again, how much can we describe them in terms of the modern scientific classification of paradise birds? To me, it matches this idea of long-tailed, multicolored birds that, in this case, I think they're associated with wind. So, and I'll get to the poems in a bit, but if you notice, many of these brocades, these textiles, they are bended, right? So there's a suggestion that the wind is blowing through them, right? And we find this in poems, right? So the earliest is from a famous author who does this kind of humor, playful poetry. So he's making a little joke. He's looking up at something in the sky. And he thinks it's maybe a paradise bird, or is it just a kite, right? And the other one is even more kind of cheeky, right? So it's saying there's leftover the windbird's meal, and this is where it's important that the most common term to describe these kind of birds are really wind birds, right? So the characters really mean wind bird. And there are other texts that will, like the later one, where we have this idea that all that these birds eat is wind, and what they defecate is just farts, and so it's wind farts. But these are associated here with plum blossoms. So the suggestion is that the smell, right, the fragrance of plum blossoms is actually the product of wind birds. Very beautiful kind of accommodation of that story. But I think that there's something similar going on here, right? So the birds have been introduced here that matches the theme of the wind. Can we have another microphone? Just no enough. And later on, this is something that is mentioned in the only significant research that's been done so far on this topic. This is the chapter by Martha Chaitin on exotic birds in early modern Japan, in Japanimals. Right? That's a book where she mentions this text, the tales of the world of law, and there is the chapter where we have this allegory of different types of birds taking the stand and kind of representing different types of people. So we've seen different similar techniques yesterday in Andreakri's paper, and the bird of paradise, the wind bird is there, and it's interesting that both the wind bird and the bird of paradise are featured, right? But the bird of paradise is in a strictly Buddhist context, while the wind bird is somehow like an ideal, the birdiest of birds, and it's closest to this idea of birdahood. So it's kind of wordplay from Buddhahood to birdahood, and so it's and Ando Shoeki is someone who contrasts the corrupted world of humans with that of nature, including of animals, right? So it's kind of an idealized view, but it hinges on the same idea, right? That they only eat wind. Right? It's slightly different context, right? So this is considered philosopher or intellectual. He's kind of adapting this idea. It shows already this idea circulating. Then we have another text that was also mentioned in Martha's paper earlier, Honjo Shokan. So it's a kind of review of, I think it's mostly pharmacological, right? So it's culinary things you can eat, but things that are useful for the body. Right? So this is in the context of this Honzogaku, this pharmacological studies that extend to just classifications of natural things. So in this context, and this translation is not done, so it's very crude. So it's something I still need to work on. But there's a description and the rough, rendering of this story, right? That they open their mouths to the wind as if they were eating. Then there's a mention here of foreigners bringing in these birds, but that's the part I need to work on. So the point is that this is a different context. And so it's a context of classifications of nature. Okay? We're different in a poetic context. Then we also have, again, pharmacological. So you can see on the reverse side of this page, there is a illustration of a plant. So again, pharmacology, but also you have these, different, special items. Right? And the first in this category is paradise birds, and we can tell that these are skinned. So this is not the live bird. Interestingly, this author has a little section describing the wind bird, and he says, I know this from my teacher, from Matsuoka Genrin. So in this case, he might have not seen a actual skin, he might have gotten a illustration, a kind of copy of of the skin, and then asked his master, his Confucian teacher, about that. Right? There's a different mode of transmission of knowledge. For some reason, it became all caps. It wasn't supposed to be, but there's a beautiful quote from a great book on this topic, on pharmacological studies, the knowledge of nature, where Marcon gets to the heart of what is going on here, right? So we have the same object or object of knowledge that is handled differently by different intellectual traditions, or it's put to different uses. Right? So noematic, he calls it noematic, which is mental image. Right? So the mental image can be very different depending on, I argue, it's depending on how it circulates. Right? The media that it is embodied in, and its social context. So I love this context. It's a dictionary, and Arai Hakuseki he was actually mentioned in the sword paper as describing Li Po Po as having a bird-headed sword. So he's a Confucius scholar who has a very accurate rendition of the European version of the narrative of the Paradise Bird. So he mentions, and this is something again that was a recent revelation. When I asked the man of that land about this bird, he tells him, right, they're not seen alive. This whole idea of the skins. So, and then I remember this Arai Hakuseki. This guy actually met a foreigner, right? So there's this famous episode where an Italian missionary enters Japan and he's captured and questioned by Arai Hakuseki. And we know that he used, I mean, it's a very plausible assumption that during this questioning, this map was used. And so basically, Hakuseki asks Sidoti about things in the world. Right? But the thing about this particular map is that it has also little illustrations on the bottom of wonders of the world, or representative animals from different Sunda, Sumatra, and the kind of geographically organized plants. There is one little illustration of birds here, and again, I haven't looked at this closely, but now knowing about that text, I looked again. Right, there's a cassowary, and then there is a skin of a paradise bird. And I don't have enough. I haven't looked at the real thing. The scan is not precise enough to look at the text, but we can imagine, right? We can imagine Hakuseki pointing to the illustration, saying, "What is this? Right? What is this shape?" It's a bit hard to understand. And then the missionary explains, the translator explains this whole thing, and then 11 years later, Hakuseki puts it in the dictionary. So it's kind of a rare example where you can reconstruct the conversation about this bird. Also, quite a remarkable object. Later, 90 years later, another scholar studies this map, translates most of the text, but interestingly, he's not interested in the paradise bird. Right? He only puts a little paper. He pastes. Right? He sticks a piece of paper with a Japanese name for cassowary, but he doesn't care about, or maybe doesn't understand that this is a paradise bird. Right? He didn't have anyone to explain. So different generations, right? They get different things out of this text, this source. Also, in this map is a beautiful rendition of this Copernican idea of the planets around the sun. And I'm showing this because we have a later folding screen which borrows some elements from that map and others. It uses its main maps are newer. So this is 1790s. This is again almost 90 years after that initial map was first used, and we have these illustrations here on the top. I want to focus on these. These are it's quite a known source, but I don't think anybody looks in detail at these. So first of all, we have the Dutch. We can tell that the Dutch are known for studying plants here, and also we have a lot of more common birds around, right? So I'll show you. You can see it here, a collection of more common birds, but also exotic. I mean, the turkey actually was considered an exotic bird in Japan. Yeah. But then up in the heavens we have, and this is again something I hadn't noticed, you have to look for it. There are these long-tailed birds. I mean, I don't know of any paradise bird in the scientific sense that is completely white. These might be parrots, right? But they are in that cultural context of being a paradise bird, right? That's kind of one of my points, that it is, in some cases, it's not as helpful to look for scientific identification, but just to understand the context in which they're placed. Right? This is a depiction of the globe. Then up here is the sun and moon, right? And we have these Buddhist angels, right? These Buddhist figures. Which are, have a long pedigree, but then this insertion of exotic birds flying in heaven, right? Incredible hybrid, this kind of combination of all available knowledge in a way. So again, our scientific framework is not very useful here. Right? It's different flows of circulation knowledge that are meeting here. Other contexts, so again, as mentioned in Martha's chapter, in 1764 is when we have the first mention of live paradise birds gifted. So we start to get a shift in what is accessible to document. We still have, the skins are still around, right? So what is interesting about this quote is that you could even see it in temples, right? You could even, temples would show off their treasures to gather money. So it was part of the attractions, right? For anyone. It wasn't just elite intellectuals and shogun. Right? So you have a wider reception of these, but also live birds can be seen, right? So you have bird stores, like we've seen this morning in Hong Kong. But also rare bird displays, right? So this is just one example. There are earlier ones where they're called peacock tea houses, but it wasn't just peacocks. It was just kind of spectacular bird displays. So you would pay a fee, and so we started to get really a wide distribution of this. And it changes from skins, both have skins and live birds available. And these start to be, that's why I asked about the bird albums earlier, because we start to get these very precise renditions painting. And many of them are for documentary purpose, right? So, as again from Martha's chapter, we know there was a large influx of birds, and not all of them were wanted. So the Dutch would just bring many of them and kind of distribute them or sell them, right? So the shogun or the Nagasaki magistrate would receive these kind of paintings and just say, oh, I want this bird and this bird. So it's kind of a mail order catalog. But again, you have a combination. In this case, I can't tell if this is a live bird. It could be a skin, right? But we have other examples where it's very obviously a vivid specimen. Right? Right, and this is belongs to that kind of studio, bird albums, but then the text quotes Yamato Honzo, which is a pharmacological work. So again, we have two different streams intersecting. So just to end off, trying to, how do you visualize this? Because this is not linear, right? And I'm playing this idea of media ecosystem, right? So different configurations of different media, right? And this is not even enough. There should be more little bubbles, right? Because the images, there can be different types of images, right? But they come together in different mix, different configurations, right? So, and these go back and forth. There is no, it's not useful to think of a gradual, let's say, better knowledge of these birds, right? It's just what is relevant in a specific context. And that's why I talk about contact agent, because we are following the same thing, but we can follow it to different contexts, right? Different bubbles. Okay, I think I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Radu, for this great presentation. I'm sure there will be quite some questions. For the first question, I will pass it to Sharon.
Just a very short question for Radu. Yeah, it's very interesting for your presentation. I'm quite curious from the findings in Japan. Do you find any Mandarin ducks? Yeah.
Yeah, and these later.
It's also spread in East Asia. I'm quite curious about in Japanese literature and also the painting.
Definitely, it has the same symbolism.
Any specific symbolism for Mandarin ducks in
Same
Japan?
marital happiness.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it
definitely.
comes up on folding screens,
Yeah.
on many media.
Scrolls, yeah.
But do they mainly emphasize on male Mandarin?
Pair. It's almost always a pair.
Yeah.
Always a pest, not single one.
There's no, I don't know any single. That's the whole point that it's
Marital.
So both appear in both,
Yeah.
not only single.
At least I haven't studied it, but as far as I've observed, it's always both.
Highly recommend you to.
Okay, the second question.
I have a couple of comments, and well, I suppose it all falls more in the line of comments. But one of the things about the Blau map is you have to be also aware that it, even at the point that Huxley was using it, it's more than 50 years old. So like European knowledge is way past that. And also, I was wondering why you didn't reference some of the not necessarily strictly Honzo Gaku, but the Western texts that came in, like notably Johnstone has picture of birds of paradise, and because these, I mean, we tend to think of scholars and artists as moving in completely separate directions, but they don't. Not in Japan, and then in the same vein, like I can't remember specifically because of course I only look at what I'm looking at, but I'm almost positive Waka Sansai has like a phoenix and a windbird. I mean, there's a couple birds. I mean, it'll be worth checking because that would be. This is Waka Sansai is like an encyclopedia from 1713, and judging by the number of copies that still exist, it was probably very widely available, even though it's like 118 volumes or something. So, but I'm sure that there's stuff in that. And in public display, you mentioned the temples and the like the Kujakujaya, which is the peacock tea houses, but also I don't know specifically, but you might want to check Misemono. Like Misemono is like fairs and stuff on the street where people would pay to go and see stuff. I know there was lots of bird acts where they would train birds to do little tricks and stuff. So there could have been, that's worth checking as well. So sorry, it wasn't a question, it was more comments, but I just thought I'd mention that.
So, and just to mention, Wakan Sansaji is definitely what people would check, right? It's very accessible. They would even people in villages would have this.
I mean, so many copies of this massive encyclopedia are still around. It must have been very widely available because there's like every library in Japan has a pre-modern copy. It's many copies around.
Okay.
Thank you, Radu. I have one question. Is the long tail is one of the characteristic to call paradise bird in Japanese in Japan culture?
That's a good question because it's the fact that many paradise birds have long tails, and certainly the ones. The idea, the worth of paradise birds is in the long plumage. So then but I think you're hitting on something which is the lack of specificity. It could be onagadori. There are other birds that have long tails, right? So I don't know enough about all the species that have long tails that could be imported. I tend to notice them in these contexts where they are in a paradise context, right, like we've seen with the Buddhist angels. So that's something I need to kind of be more precise about, right? So you've seen there are these white birds which don't correspond to a paradise bird, but they have the long tail. So I'm still thinking about it. So I'm still not sure if that's a defining feature or.
Actually, developing on your question, quite interesting. Even in Indonesia, in Java, for example, paradise birds were quite rare. Actually, I mean, they are rarely depicted, and in pre-Islamic period, there's obviously only one depiction of either cassowary or bird of paradise. On Panataran temple that Lydia discussed today, but in different contexts, not on those medallions, but on reliefs. It's just ornamental part of one, obviously, paradisiacal scene, basically. So, yeah, these birds are really limited to eastern parts of the Indo-Malay world and to Papua New Guinea, basically. So they were exotic even for the people who traded them to Japanese and Chinese, environment. So basically, it's quite interesting to see that there must have been really rare until quite some period, like 18th century. Obviously, it must have been rare, precious gift, and Dutch obviously profited from this kind of invisible flow of these skins because it must have been always limited. We know it was traded in Europe, actually very early, by the early 16th century, by first Portuguese visitors, but even by that time, it must have been super rare. I mean, until the 18th century, birds of paradise must have represented a kind of spectacular singularity among the birds traded to other parts of than easternmost parts of the Indo-Malay worlds. So it's quite interesting, and on that Panataran relief, they have really very long tail feathers. And it seems that these long tail feathers generally are somehow related to this kind of paradisiacal or situation that's specific, that's heavenly or whatever. I have one actually probably ignorant comment. You talk about winter season, one of those paintings. There is winter season bird, meal, right? Something like that.
Wind.
Oh. Wind season. Oh, wind season. Okay, so then I will not voice out my ignorant comment because I understood it as a winter season, And then I elaborated on the concept of monsoon winds because sunbirds were really coming with monsoons because you have trading season following the monsoonal system. But I am completely ignorant about the situation of Japan. I mean, some products were simply called, you know, monsoon product or winter product or summer product in some contexts. It depends on how you segment your cycle. And then there would make a kind of sense if it was traded in that period to call the bird by the name of the period. But wind makes it completely. It would make it really ignorant, the question. So I will I will skip it off.
The topic is relevant. I mean, seasonality is important, but in this case, it's not. That's it. So we have cherry blossoms associated with them, but then we have the plum blossoms,
which are earlier, it's a month earlier.
Okay.
but the Dutch would come. There is this association with when the Dutch ships come in, right? It was in September.
Yeah.
So it was I think a poetic word,
Okay.
right? A seasonal word. Say the Dutch ship associated with early autumn, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So how do you differentiate those from like depictions of phoenixes? And is there, because they're also depicted with long tails?
It's just that it's easier to say they're phoenixes, right? It's because of their plumage, their heads, right? In this case, it's less distinctive. Right? It really look like these ones look like sparrows with long tails.
Yeah,
right?
well, because they've never seen them, they're yeah.
So that's the kind of crude answer that phoenixes are more distinctive, and these are less.
And would the context make a difference? Like phoenixes are usually depicted in this kind of context, whereas when birds have different contexts.
I just haven't looked. I found some examples of phoenixes, but I didn't think enough about what the context is for phoenixes. So I need to look more to that.
That's why we have conferences, so we can get new ideas, right?
Compare with phoenix.
Well,
It might be overlap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Some more questions in the audience? If there are no other questions, we can close this last section, and probably, because we are, is it 5:30 now actually?
Yeah.
Okay, so we are a little bit fast behind our schedule. We should wrap up and invite you to roundtable discussion for the last half an hour, basically.